Good day to you, and thank you for joining us for this final segment in the debate entitled, Israel Only, Is It Scripturally Defendable? Before I begin, I'd like to share a few thoughts about Mr. Miano. In this debate, Mr. Miano has proven himself to be fearless in the face of a difficult proposition. He has also conducted himself with courtesy and professionalism. After this debate is over, I believe both of us will be able to enjoy the fellowship of a shared faith in the one true God of Israel, knowing the doors are open to continued friendly dialogue on this issue. I'm also thankful for the opportunity to present a closing statement that will bring all of this together into one cohesive summary in favor of Israel only being scripturally defendable. But first, a brief response to what Mr. Miano has said in his second rebuttal. Mr. Miano said, quote, "The full preterist believes that everything necessary for the salvation of God's people, eschatological and redemptive elements, were fulfilled in the first century, thus making known the sons of God. Sons of God, as John 1, verse 12 through 13 says, which I mentioned in my opening statement, are made manifest by faith in Jesus Christ, by covenant, not by bloodline." Unquote. But Mr. Miano has clearly missed where Jesus defined his people as Israel. For example, Matthew 2, verse 6 in the NKJV says, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." Thus, the sons of God were not every Joe and Jane Doe with a guilty conscience who decided to bow a knee and say a little prayer. They were people of Israel. And if there are any doubts as to who exactly Jesus died for, all one has to do is turn to either Hebrews 9, verse 15, or John 11, verses 51 through 52. John 11, verses 51 through 52 says, "Now he," referring to Caiaphas, "did not say this on his own initiative, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who were scattered abroad." Clearly, we can see that even Jesus' enemies expected him to die for Israel, with no one else mentioned or implied. We can also see two groups here. We see the whole nation and those not for that nation only, who were the children of God. Those people were not just anyone who believed in Jesus, but were those of the nation, the ethnos of Israel, who were scattered abroad, with no one else mentioned or implied. Okay, well, at this point, the relevant questions are, has Israel only been shown to be scripturally defendable? And did Mr. Miano show that it was not scripturally defendable? Recall that in my opening statement, we saw how the entire redemptive narrative, including God's relationship with man, the law, forgiveness, atonement, covenants, promises, adoption, judgment, hell, the lake of fire, salvation, and redemption pertained only to Old Covenant Israel and was part of their redemptive narrative, which ended in AD 70. Mr. Miano had nothing to say about any of that. We also saw that the Gentiles Paul and the disciples preached the gospel to were linked to Israel either by being descendants of the tribes of Israel or proselytes to Judaism who later believed in Jesus. And we saw how the New Testament was penned for Jews and the elect diaspora, not for us. We saw no argument from Mr. Miano on any of that. We saw how only Israel had and was under the law, that God only had a relationship with Israel, that Israel was the only nation God went to with a message of redemption, and that God only called Israel his people. We also saw how the disciples preached the gospel to only Jews for the first 10 years, and thereafter to both Jews and Gentiles, whom we saw were the elect diaspora, descendants of the tribes of Israel who had been scattered among the nations. We saw no argument from Mr. Miano on any of that. We saw that the knowledge about Christ was, per Acts 2 verse 36, intended for Israel. We saw how Mr. Miano himself agreed that the promise was for Israel, that, as he said, quote, God has chosen Israel, and throughout the Old Testament, he is dealing with them, unquote. And that, quote, what is written in the Old Testament and the New Testament were promises to Israel, unquote. And that, quote, the hope of Israel was entirely fulfilled in AD 70, unquote. With Mr. Miano making such powerful statements affirming Israel only, who needs a debate? We also saw how Mr. Miano and many other preterists are selective and inconsistent with audience relevance. We saw how the disciples were planning for an end, not a continuation. We saw examples of Gentile descendants of the tribes of Israel fulfilling end-time prophecy. And we've seen I.O. affirmed by sound logical conclusions based on true premises, none of which Mr. Miano even mentioned. In other words, we saw Israel only as an orthodox view for first century Christians, unchallenged for the entire debate. Recall that in my opening statement, I invited Mr. Miano to tear down all the evidence I had presented showing I.O. is scripturally defendable, and to erect his own independent case for his view of the Bible's redemptive narrative, including all humanity. Did he do that? I will leave it up to you to decide that. Personally, I don't consider a scriptureless commentary on some imaginary meta-narrative to be convincing. So, what remains? Since Mr. Miano could not argue against all the redemptive elements I mentioned that are clearly limited to Old Covenant Israel, what remains is Mr. Miano's assumption that a continuing kingdom is available to people outside of Old Covenant Israel. What kingdom was that? Even the disciples knew that Jacob, or Israel, was the kingdom that would be restored. Acts 1 verse 6 in the New American Standard Bible says, so when they had come together, they were asking him, saying, Lord, is it at this time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel? Where is the victorious pronouncement of the kingdom being available to everyone? Why were no foreign nations named? Because the kingdom was always Jacob, or Israel. Luke said, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. Luke chapter 1, verse 33. Daniel said it was a kingdom that would not be left to anyone else. Daniel 2, verse 44. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. Did you catch the power of that? The kingdom was Jacob, Israel, and it would not be left to anyone else. Not Greece, not Italy, not Arabia, not Germany, not Canada, and not the USA. So, how does someone get into the kingdom today? They don't. People who say, but we're spiritual Israel, are mistaken. Spiritual Israel was the believing Israel within the overall scope of Israel. It was the Israel of faith in contrast to the Israel of the law. Recall that when Paul said in Romans 10, verse 1, "Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them," referring to Israel, "is for their salvation." No one else was mentioned or implied. That's because salvation and redemption were always meant for those under the law, Israel. Salvation and redemption were meant for those God made a covenant with, Israel, not anyone today. Some say, but look, the gates to the New Jerusalem never closed. From Revelation 21, verse 25. That's true. And when Revelation 21, verse 12 describes the 12 gates leading into the New Jerusalem, whose names are on those gates? Revelation 21, verse 12 says, "It had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names were written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel." The entrances to the city were not being advertised to attract anyone other than Old Covenant Israel. What this imagery is showing is that it's only through Old Covenant Israel that one got into the New Jerusalem. However, there is no Old Covenant Israel today. All Israel was saved as Paul said it would in Romans 11, verse 26, and the fullness of the Gentiles already came in. Nobody has gone through those symbolic gates since AD 70. Additionally, both Old and New Testament scriptures abound with references to people outside of Israel being considered unclean. In 2 Corinthians 6, verse 17, we see how the term unclean is associated with people outside of Israel engaging in idolatry. And in Acts 10, verse 28, we can see that Jews considered people they believed to be outside of Israel to be unclean. In Revelation 21, verse 27, people outside of Israel are still considered unclean, and they do not enter the city. Revelation 21, verse 27 says, "And nothing unclean, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life." Revelation 21, verse 27 clearly precludes anyone outside of Old Covenant Israel coming into the city. Thus, when John said, probably between the years AD 65 and 68, "The Spirit and the bride say, 'Come,' and let the one who hears say, 'Come,' and let the one who is thirsty come, let the one who desires take the water of life without price," in Revelation 22:17, he's inviting the lost sheep of Israel to come through gates they would have recognized. There is simply no way into the New Jerusalem for us, because there is no gate for people outside of Old Covenant Israel to enter. People often cling to the idea that the New Covenant Church was a new beginning that continues today. But a new beginning does not necessarily continue indefinitely. If there is anything that continues, it is a world without Old Covenant Israel. As we saw earlier in the debate, the early church was planning for an end, not a continuation. I can only ask preterists today, what does the term "the end" mean? And hope they answer reasonably. For example, when Peter said, "The end of all things is near," in 1 Peter 4, verse 7, did that mean a continuation or an end? I think it's time we had an honest discussion about that. The scriptures show that the pre-AD 70 gospel was a homologous, uniform message for Old Covenant Israel. The gospel directed to Israel was that through Christ, salvation and redemption from the law, from the wrath of God, from their enemies, and from sin itself was available to them along with the promised inheritance. In contrast, the post AD 70 gospel had no mention of Israel, and there was no homologous uniform doctrine or mission to reach Jews and the elect diaspora, and there was no emphasis on salvation and redemption. Michael Green outlines in his book Evangelism in the First Century that the emphasis of the gospel immediately following AD 70 was that through faith in Jesus, one could live a new, better life. Post-AD 70 Christians even missed the significance of events leading up to and including AD 70. The gathering of Israel in the last days, the promised inheritance given to the righteous of Israel, the passing away of the law, the greatest tribulation known in the history of Old Covenant Israel. Not a word of these things is mentioned in texts authored by Christians within a generation of those events. Christians who believed Jesus' return was still to come. Notably, the pre-AD 70 church was in one accord in its infancy, Acts 2 verse 1 and Acts 2 verse 46. And even as late as Acts 15 verse 25, which was over 10 years after the day of Pentecost. The disciples' mission was to preach the gospel to Jews and to seek out the elect diaspora from the nations, to get all who were called of that generation sealed for the day of redemption, so that the fullness of Gentiles would come in, and as Paul said, so all Israel would be saved. Their mission was accomplished in as few as 24 years. Paul wrote in his Roman epistle around AD 57, "Their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world." Romans 10 verse 18. And "My gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ has been made known to all nations." Romans 16 verses 25 through 26. All who were meant to hear the gospel heard it. In contrast to the pre-AD 70 church, the post-AD 70 so-called church was not in one accord. It was a sea of constantly evolving, changing, and debated doctrines and practices based on various oral traditions and many different texts, only a few of which we find in the New Testament. Indeed, during the first years after AD 70, there were many Gospels being circulated along with those of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was an eschatological, soteriological, and Christological conundrum on par with today's denominationalism. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Secret Book of James, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Philip were considered true by many post-AD 70 Christians. Apparently, Israel's redemptive narrative was forgotten or unknown by many within a generation after those events transpired, and replaced with a new narrative that borrowed from Old Covenant Israel's texts and was developed by people far removed from the exclusively Hebrew cultural and religious milieu that Israel's redemptive narrative came from. Why did such a fluid and changing gospel spread so fast among those not affiliated with Israel? The post-AD 70 gospel was appealing because it offered hope to the disenfranchised of society, like the poor, women, children, and the elderly, people who could relate to the stories they had heard about Jesus. It also provided those who were poor and alone a much-needed source of unity and connection with others. Stories about Jesus' compassion for others were powerful in a time and culture characterized by cruelty and war. Like so many today, people in the post-AD 70 world simply weren't aware that the original application of those stories and parables were for an audience of Jews and the elect diaspora of Israel. Does Israel only mean that God does not love us? that we have no hope? No. The Bible says God is love in 1 John 4, verse 8, and that God does not change, Malachi 3, verse 6, and James 1, verse 7. We see in Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 through 19, that God cares for all the fatherless, the widows, and even loves strangers to Israel. We see from 1 Kings 8, verses 41 to 43, that even strangers to Israel can pray to the God of Israel. We can see God's compassion for people outside of the kingdom demonstrated in the story of Jesus' healing of the Canaanite woman's daughter in Matthew chapter 15. We see God's love for people outside the kingdom demonstrated in the story of the rich young ruler. Quote, and Jesus, looking at him, loved him, unquote, from Mark 10, verse 21. These stories are as powerful and can be as meaningful to us today as they were in the first century. They can give us hope, just not the hope of Israel. Personally, I believe God can answer prayer, do miraculous healings, deliver people from bondage, and change lives as much today as he did for those in Israel's redemptive narrative. I also believe God knows who is seeking him with their whole heart. And should he choose to prolong my existence after my last breath, I am content to find out about it then. Today, we have the opportunity to love God and each other independent of a redemptive narrative that didn't have us in mind. We have the opportunity to be consistent in our application of audience relevance and go wherever the evidence leads, even if that means a paradigm change is on the horizon. Thank you.